Their mouths were too wide for their faces. At least, that was the first thing I noticed about these people. They all seemed to be staring at me. Not in a threatening manner, but with equal parts curiosity and desire. Like a kid when presented with a new toy. I'm not sure the analogy was apt. Growing up, my parents were never sober for long enough to buy me anything. I woke up in a cold sweat, eyes adjusting to the TV's glow still illuminating my dingy apartment. The familiar sight of Derek sprawled on the couch with a beer in his hand calmed me down a bit. Though the feeling replacing my fear was a kind of disgusting familiarity. My friends always asked me what I had seen in him. An overweight alcoholic without stable employment. Honestly, I didn't know either. Did I wake you? Derek's grunt snapped me out of my introspection, still stumbling over my words. I hurriedly explained my nightmare, as if I would get a comforting response. Unsurprisingly, he just snorted in derision and said something about how it didn't sound scary at all. That was true. My description of the dream sounded ridiculous. And the bottle of Xanax on the countertop next to my bed did little to help my case. Still, shouldn't Derek have been more concerned? Adding another point to my ever-growing list of reasons to leave him. I buried my head under the covers, hoping to squeeze in a few more hours of sleep until my next shift. The walk to work was depressing as always. The sight of the sizable homeless population didn't make me feel grateful about my situation. Instead, I was just reminded of how easily I could become one of them, with the gigantic billboards for luxury brands over their heads laughing at their expense. I'd run away from home once or twice in my teenage rebellious phase. And what I'd experienced had taught me how foolish an idea it was. Working a dead-end job was shit, but it was heaven compared to what the scarred old man with a 1,000-yard stare sitting by the bus station went through on a daily basis. I stopped briefly in front of my workplace before entering. The gigantic orange chicken that served as the diner's logo grinned down at me, half of its head dim because of the busted light that nobody bothered fixing. I'd always found it ironic that the mascot of a fried chicken place was a chicken. At least I didn't have to dress up as that chicken for kids' birthday parties as some of my co-workers did. Usually college part-timers who were bullied into doing so by the rest of the staff. Did kids even like seeing that kind of thing? I thought to myself, if it was my birthday party, I'd be pretty embarrassed by the appearance of a man-sized rooster that reeked of sweat and frying oil. Then again, maybe the kids liked laughing at the plight of the poor worker inside the suit, just like the wide-mouthed people had liked laughing at me. Wait a second, did they laugh at me in the dream? God, I need a coffee to clear my head. I hurried inside the diner, driven equally by thirst for caffeine and fear of the chicken storefront sign that suddenly seemed to be smiling wider than usual. I had barely managed to get the lid off the cheap foam cup when I got called into my manager's office. To call it an office would be generous. It was basically a glorified cupboard with several posters showing Employee of the Month. Unsurprisingly, they all featured the manager's son Michael, a rotund man around 30 years of age. It was unclear why he was working at this place and treating it like a family-run business. His entire personality seemed to be designed to be as creepy as possible. Aside from his constant groping and sexist comments towards female workers, he was also never seen without a cheap beer in hand, guffawing at his own jokes while stinking up the place with his body odor and alcohol fumes. Surprisingly, his father Will was his complete opposite in demeanor. Tall and thin, Will carried himself with dignity despite his age, worked diligently, and rarely spoke, given different circumstances. I might actually have found him a pleasant person to work with. Michael said you assaulted him yesterday after work. Listening to this accusation, I was painfully reminded of Will's one flaw. He was extremely trusting and overprotective of his son. One would wonder how Michael, someone truly with the face even a mother wouldn't love, convinced his father that he could do no wrong. Damn it. I've got to think of a way to get myself out of this one. Normally, I would have been a lot more confident in my case, but the main issue with any defense that I could make was that I did assault Michael. More accurately, after enduring too many of his disgusting comments, I had flung my cup of hot coffee at his face before kicking him in the balls and leaving him to writhe in pain. I see you don't have much to say for yourself. Will continued coldly. Look, our finances aren't looking that good right now, with the recession going on, and it's obvious that you don't enjoy working here. So I think it would be prudent for me to quit and save everyone the hassle. Yeah, that's what I'm going to do, I answered robotically. I wasn't about to beg for my job, especially given how I was treated. And arguing further would just be a waste of time. Another factor was Will's appearance. Something seemed off with his eyes, almost like they were spaced too close together. I had never noticed it before, but something about them was making me unwilling to negotiate unceremoniously. I took off the apron that I had just put on and briskly walked towards the door. On my way out, I spotted Michael scarfing down fried chicken, getting even more grease on his already filthy face. Was his chin even more bloated than when I last saw him? Averting my eyes to spare myself the disgust, I instead found myself looking at an image of the chicken mascot on the wall. There was no doubt about it. Its smile was wide enough to be called a grin, and I could almost imagine the interior of it. Do chicken even have teeth? I shook my head and slammed the door on my way out. As one last fuck you to this place, in an even fouler mood than usual because of recent events, I left my workplace, former workplace, hurriedly, wanting to leave this place behind. Sounds of a scuffle ahead, however, stopped me in my place. To call it a scuffle, to be fair, was a poor description. It was more of a beatdown. 3 young men armed with bats were surrounding a cowering figure who was backed against a wall. I took a closer look and realized it was the scarred old man from before. Heard you came back from the war a few years ago, pal. Had fun killing babies. Maybe you can show us how tough you are. One of the men sneered. He then walked up and, without hesitation, drove his fist into the old man's stomach. Thugs, I thought. It's a wonder that people like that exist. Shouldn't bystanders have stopped them before it escalated to this? My hypocrisy made me feel a sudden twinge of guilt. But what happened next replaced it with fear and disgust. Before the old man could even fall to the ground, the thugs were on him, lashing out with their weapons. I heard audible cracks as the man's bones snapped under the assault, and one brief sight of his bloodied face and likely broken skull made me wish I'd averted my eyes. However, I was frozen, looking unblinkingly as levels of violence I didn't even think possible were orchestrated right in front of me on the sidewalk. The last time I saw his face was when a baseball bat was shoved into his mouth, teeth splintering off in a mist of blood and other fluids. He laid face down after that, with the aggressors still kicking and stomping on him, screaming obscenities. Why are these young men so full of rage? A part of my mind, detached from the horrific acts in front of me, asked idly, surely they didn't even know this homeless man. What could drive someone to beat a total stranger like that? Eventually, the thugs got tired and stopped, unzipping their jeans and urinating on the unmoving body before swaggering off, confident their crime would not hold consequences. They were right. The police wouldn't bother, and the pool of blood and piss on the ground would likely be washed away by one of the downpours that plagued this city. As for the body, well, it wasn't like I was certain the guy was dead. He could get up and go to a hospital on his own. I tried to make a mental note of what the thugs looked like, just so I could avoid them if I came across them in the future. Except, was I going crazy? Or did they all look exactly alike? As I watched them disappear into a derelict building on the other side of the road, I could have sworn they all walked and moved exactly the same way. Were they triplets or something? I could not recall their appearances. My foggy mind was at its limit. Letting out a sigh, I turned around and walked back the way I came, even though the other route would take twice as long. There was no way I would walk through that blood-stained sidewalk. Imagine my surprise when, turning a corner, I was faced with the very same bloodstains. I paused for a moment as my mind raced to find an explanation. I wasn't on medication, was I? The detached part of my mind spoke up again. Though if I was drugged enough, maybe I wouldn't even remember taking it. That's when I saw him, standing behind the scene of violence. A boy looked on with an unfazed expression. He could scarcely have been 12, dressed snugly in a wool sweater and mittens, the quality suggesting a hefty price tag behind them. What caught my gaze, however, was not his youth or his calm demeanor, but the size of his eyes. They were gigantic. When I say they were as large as saucers, it is no exaggeration. They suddenly swiveled to meet my gaze, and I found myself taking a step back out of, what could I even call it? Surprise? Fear? His irises were shockingly blue, a kind of sapphire that couldn't even be achieved with contact lenses. His gaze, strangely vacant, unnerved me. It was as if he was looking through me, focusing on an event far behind me, or worse, deep inside of me. I realized with a jolt that it was disturbingly like that of the homeless veteran. Didn't soldiers only come home with them after witnessing countless atrocities? What was that look doing on the face of a well-off preteen boy? You see it, don't you? The boy asked in an eerie tone. Was it pity that I detected in his voice? Or was it sympathy? Either way, it didn't sound like anything a boy would say. See, what? Are you lost? Do you need help finding your parents? I hesitantly asked, despite his appearance. I felt captivated by him. One part of me was telling me that this could be a big break for me. Rich kid lost in a bad neighborhood, who likely didn't have many friends because of his freakishly large eyes and odd manner of speech. With luck, his parents would reward me for returning him safely. Perhaps even with a lucrative babysitting job that could hardly be worse than dealing with rude customers all day. However, another part of me told me that I wouldn't like his answer, that I should leave the scene as quickly as possible. Hell, I could get implicated in the crime, even disregarding that. Everything about the situation struck me as very, very wrong. Greed, avarice, like a mouth gaping wide. The boy answered. His gaze seemed to return from whatever he was looking at and focused on something a bit closer to us. I turned to find out what he was looking at, only to realize I had been standing in front of a huge campaign banner for a local politician, promising to revitalize the area. It was a banner I had seen many times, posted all over the district. However, this one portrayed what seemed to be a bad caricature of that man. His nose and mouth were disproportionately large, with teeth jutting out in almost predatory fashion in many ways. It reminded me of that one image anti-Semites use on the internet, depicting a bearded man rubbing his hands together. Whoever made this banner didn't do his research though, since as far as I knew that politician didn't even have any Jewish ancestry. I shook my head and turned back to the boy. He was gone, as well as the half-dead homeless man. I took in this information with calm that surprised even myself, possibly numbed from all the events that had happened already. Perhaps the boy had brought the man to receive medical treatment. That's why they were both gone. As for why they were gone so quickly and why I hadn't heard anything, maybe the boy's parents had picked them up in a car. Those new model electric cars these days don't make much noise. Maybe they'd just sped off without me noticing. A large part of me knew this was bullshit, that I was probably already in over my head in something I couldn't comprehend. However, everything was bullshit to me at that point. If some ghost kid wanted to magic away a dying old man in front of me, so be it. It wasn't going to pay my rent and utilities, so I wasn't going to spend more thought on it, trying to reorient myself after this unexpected detour. I swore to myself as I saw a few raindrops start to moisten the pavement, forming darker blotches that gradually took over the entire surface. Obviously, I hadn't brought my umbrella. That would be too much common sense for someone like me. Instead, I was left to walk home as fast as possible while keeping my pace slow enough there wasn't a risk of slipping and falling. In this city, when it rained, it truly poured. I could barely see in front of me as I speed walked in the general direction of my home, bumping past concerned people who all seemed to be carrying umbrellas. Was I really the only one this forgetful? Hell, even the heroin addict sprawled on the street had a poncho on. He winked and wolf whistled as I passed, making me shudder in revulsion at his yellow-toothed leer. Was I seeing things, or were his teeth sharper than usual? When I got home, Derek was still in the same position, with the only difference being a few more empty cans scattered on the floor around him. Christ, does he ever move? Internally cursing whoever had put me in this mess. I took longer than I cared to admit to realize that I was cursing myself. Why are you back so early? Don't you have work? Derek barked at me after realizing I was standing in the doorway. I pondered how to answer him. Should I be honest about losing my job? Or could I possibly distract him with my tale about the grisly scene I saw on my way back? I didn't get to make a decision before it was made for me in the form of tepid beer drenching the front of my shirt. You must have gotten fired for being lazy, you useless bitch, he snarled, crushed beer can in his fist. Who's the lazy one here? I contemptuously thought, but avoided his glare, instead staring intently at the cracked floorboards. Making eye contact at this point would only result in more bruises that would have to be explained away. I was not keen on sporting a black eye for the rest of the month. This is bad, I thought as I tensed my body in preparation for a blow. Derek would usually have been too tired to get angry at this time of the day, but clearly beer wasn't the only substance he consumed last night. I should have anticipated this when I noticed him rummaging through the drawers for cash last week. Whatever he was on, it helped him move faster than I had ever seen him move. In a flash, he was on me, sharp edge of the beer can cutting into my cheek before his other hand wrapped around my throat. Losing my balance, I fell backwards, the back of my skull bearing the brunt of our combined weight against the cold tiles of the floor. The sudden flare of pain blossomed spots across my vision, before it started dimming from the lack of oxygen. Crap, he's actually trying to kill me, I thought as I weakly struggled, frantically scrabbling for something to defend myself with. My heart sank as my fingers felt nothing except for the sticky blood that was slowly spreading from my head wound. I tried to focus on Derek's face, to at least tell his emotions when he killed me. Would he wear an expression of relief, getting rid of me who he despised so much? Would he recoil in fear, realizing what he had done and the consequences he would suffer? Or would his rage still be unquenched, like those youths I had seen on the way home? those events seemed like an eternity ago. With every painful second dragging on as the life drained out of my body, what I saw shocked me. His face was even more grotesque than what you would typically expect from a drugged-up abuser and murderer, with eyes bulging out like a frog's and purple lips. One would have thought he was the one getting choked to death, despite looking like he was on death's door. His grip only strengthened, crushing my windpipe beyond its limit, failing to draw in a final gasp. My vision blurred again as I drifted towards unconsciousness. With a sudden jolt, I found myself kneeling on the floor, hand wrapped around something warm. A body. My body. Except it wasn't my body. Was it? The thin, pale woman before me, with a trickle of pink saliva dripping down her chin, couldn't possibly have anything to do with me. Why was I gripping her neck so tightly? I backed away from the prone figure, only to bump into a slender figure, the boy from before. Who was he, and why was he in my apartment? I quickly realized how incriminating my position must look. The woman was likely dead, and although I couldn't make sense of why, I would likely be blamed for the murder. The only witness was the boy. Making up my mind, I stretched my arm towards the boy, prepared to do what I had to. My hand never reached him. Instead, I found myself frozen in place as he stared deep into my eyes with those blue orbs of his, shining with an iridescent sheen that wasn't there before. Wait a second. Do I know him? I found myself confused. I'm sure that layer is new, but isn't this my first time meeting him? As a matter of fact, who am I anyway? You have the sight, and you wish to know. The boy suddenly spoke, despite having no idea of what he was talking about. I found myself nodding, lowering my head out of a subconscious sense of shame. The thing is, I did want to know. I wasn't sure what I wanted to know, but I was being driven by the burning desire to understand. Did I do that to the woman because of this curiosity? What did I learn from her? The sight gave you that desire within you. What have you learned about the feelings of one that walks the path of destruction and violence? What are you feeling right now? The boy continued, but I was only half listening to him as my gaze drifted over to the body of the woman. Her eyelids, slightly parted, revealed irises that were the same shade of azure as the boy's. However, they were dull and clouded. Did I do that to her? I felt nothing but a sense of numbness and indifference. Although not remembering how exactly I had strangled her, I felt like I did so out of a sense of obligation, like there was no other option. What else could I have done? Broken up with Derek before this all happened? Been nicer to Michael, tolerating more of his actions? Would there be another version of me that could have played better with the same set of cards than I was dealt? With a gasp, I sat up, inhaling air into my oxygen-starved lungs. Derek was sprawled on the floor, limbs occasionally twitching. Was he having a seizure, an overdose? A sudden crippling headache, more painful than anything I had experienced, made my head swim. I barely had time to bend over before I started vomiting the few sips of coffee I'd gotten in the morning. You see now, don't you? A voice behind me spoke up, turning while wiping bile off my chin. I came face to face with that boy. Well, at this point he's definitely a supernatural entity, so my current appearance shouldn't bother him too much, I thought to myself, trying to speak before choking on the acrid taste at the back of my throat. Everyone you've seen that disgust you with their words or actions, they don't feel like they have another choice. He continued, with your gift of sight, you can tell when someone has given themselves away to vice. However, you were trying to learn why. Why would your manager trust his son so much? Why would the youths assault an old man they barely knew? What you felt just now, what I let you feel, was indifference. They felt like it couldn't be helped, or that it was the only available course of action. The illusion of not having a choice led them down that path. What about yourself? Have you seen more in yourself from the perspective of another? Shut up, voice still raspy. I interrupted his explanation, clearly surprised. He paused and let me continue. What you're saying is that we do have another choice, right? That if we all looked deep within ourselves and acted virtuously, we'd all live in harmony. Well, news flash for you, whatever god you are. But none of us deserve to be struggling like we are. Could I have done better even under the same circumstances? Of course. If I'd worked my ass off in school and gotten into college, I could have been a doctor like I wanted to when I was little. Derek here, before he became an addict, he was an aspiring musician. He could have become the next Paul McCartney for all I know. But you already know all that, right? You knew we were destroying ourselves, and you let it happen. Curious, his eyes got brighter, and his feet seemed to melt into the ground. Clearly, he was giving up on the pretense of being human. So what you're saying is you sympathize with everyone you met today, even the violent thugs. I can't say I understand them, but I'm in no position to judge them. You're the only one who can. And you're the one that put them in that position in the first place. Strangely, I was growing irritated with this being. Who was he to put me through all this? Just to prove a point. I was tired of this sight. Or whatever he called it. Knowing things like this didn't help me at all. Instead, it seemed like it was directly correlated with my misfortune. I see, the being said while chuckling. One last question then. What are you going to do with him? He gestured towards Derek, still lying on the floor. An occasional twitch indicating he was still alive. Will you let him live, pretending nothing happened between you? Will you let him die? Or will you try to inflict the pain that you felt on him right now? I can guarantee your safety. I just wish to treat this as an experiment. He smiled at me, mouth becoming impossibly wide while his already thin lips stretched further over his perfectly white teeth. So that's what he meant by me seeing things that would disgust me. I thought, did he think he had no other choice as well? Was he just sent to perform this task by another being? Looking down on Derek, I recalled all the times we had spent together. What should I do? Should I decide purely based on how much pleasure and pain he had brought into my life? My thoughts switched to a review of my own life. To some extent, that entity was correct. There were things I had done that I wasn't proud of, and occasions where I had hurt others needlessly. A sudden realization struck me, standing up with a smile. I nodded towards the being. I knew what I had to do.